Welcome everyone, this is Music is a Journey. I'm Peter. Today's video is the third in a series that I started last year. This is called If I Had Been a Headbanger in, and then whatever the target year is. This time it's going to be If I Had Been a Headbanger in 1969. I previously did 1976, although it wasn't officially titled If I Had Been a Headbanger in 1976, because it was more or less a response to someone else's video about their favorite songs and albums from 1976. I just decided to go ahead and pick my 10 favorite heavy tracks. I also did 1974, and at that point, we really officially were in the series. So this is the second officially titled If I Had Been a Headbanger in video, and the third in the series based on the concept, which, by the way, I'll explain. In the 1980s, I was a fan of heavy metal music from the age of 12 to about 16, 17. I listened to almost nothing but heavy stuff. The heavier it was, the more interesting it was, although I did listen to some things on the lighter side as well. So this is that if I had been a teen, young teen, say 13, 14, 15, 16 years old in whatever the target year is, and I had a deep passion for really hard and heavy music, what songs would be the ones that I would gravitate to the most? Also, there's a second premise to this concept. That is that I am in charge of curating an album of 10 songs to represent some of the best, some of the hardest and heaviest music of the year. So as I introduce the 10 songs today, I'm going to list them in the order that I have chosen them to appear on this album, from the beginning of side 1 to the end of side B. Now, a couple of things to mention as an aside also. So I grew up in Canada. I was really into music, heavy metal music as a teen in Canada. So the songs I'm picking will be mostly those that I can imagine would be available to me, that I would have access to. So that means American and British heavy rock, hard rock for sure, as well as some Canadian bands. Although honestly, in 1969, I didn't single out any for the final selection. There also might be possible that I had access to some, for example, German bands or other bands in Europe, and possibly Australian. But I think my list today includes mostly British and American bands for 1969. Another thing to say, that I will be considering official releases, that's albums and singles and their B-sides. None of these, previously unreleased songs that show up on later compilations, like modern day compilations that have all these bonus tracks. Anything that wasn't released as officially as a single or on an album at the time will not be considered during the selection process. So I actually went over I have well over 30 albums from 1969 in my collection. I initially made a selection of songs and albums, a total of 30 albums to go over. Some of them I just picked out one or two songs I knew I would want to include. Some of them I decided to listen to the whole album again, and then narrowed it down to a list of about 21, and then finally 10. I will just talk about the 10 songs that I selected here. If you would like to see some of the songs that were seriously considered but were left off, I did a video about that a couple of days ago. So I will put a link at the end of this video. You'll be able to jump over to that one and see which songs I had certainly considered but decided didn't fit at the end. One other thing to say is about the history of heavy metal music. If we're looking at 1976, we are seeing the changes happening that lead up to essentially the new wave of British heavy metal, and then the American power metal scene that followed after that. 1974, we're really just at the very, very beginnings of that. It hasn't really happened yet, and we are also clear of the initial heavy music scene that occurred between 1969 and 71, 72. I like to read a lot of old articles written back in the 1970s, and it's interesting to note that from 76 to 78, various music journalists were citing the years 69 to 71 as being the heavy metal period. This was the period where, especially from an American perspective, the heavy music coming out of Britain, the UK, and other countries was actually being called heavy metal. And that is the name that stuck throughout the 70s and finally got applied to the new wave of British heavy metal and all the scene that happened there in the early 80s, when it finally really exploded big time. So what I find very interesting about 1969 is that even though we are finding the big turnaround, like where we're going from the British blues rock scene, the American garage rock scene, the whole psychedelic scene and freak beat scene and all that. We are just coming out of that, and there is a big change happening. There is a move towards harder hitting, heavier blues-based rock, as well as psychedelic rock, which is taking a turn. But even more importantly, I think, is that we are seeing this additional element of classical and jazz music coming in to heavy rock music. And of course, around the same time, we're seeing the birth of progressive rock. And a lot of the really heavy bands, particularly from the UK and also parts of Europe, were actually drawing on that heavy approach, but as well this beginning progressive approach. So particularly for the European bands, there is more of that classical and jazz element in some of the songs, which is essential to the beginning of that scene. So one thing before I get onto the list here is a final thing to say. It's very tempting to try to find as much in 1969 as possible to say that, look, it's really close to 1984. But I realize while it's possible to do that with 1976 and a little bit with 1974, 1969 is a completely different era. It is the beginning of that first big explosion of heavy rock, downer rock, and all that hard rock that happened at the time, which got labeled as heavy metal afterwards. So we cannot try to impose impressions from 1984 on 1969. Now, with all this very long introduction, let's get going. So I want to start off the album with just a really solid, punchy rocker. This might not be the best example of a heavy metal song for 1969 by this band, but it is certainly a very solid and exciting rocker. So from Grand Funk Railroad's self-titled, well, simply called Grand Funk, their second album, I want to go with track 1, Got This Thing on the Move. Paranoid, a song on here, might actually be more of a heavy metal song because of the lyrics and the atmosphere of the music. But I love how this song kicks off the album, Got This Thing on the Move. And what's really cool about it is it starts off with one riff, just a really solid, punchy riff. And then after a little bit, it changes over to a different riff, and we never hear that first riff again. Vocals, guitar, distortion in the guitar, really crunchy sound, fuzzy sound to that guitar. Great bass. Really, the bass has a strong feel in here. And then, of course, drums. So that is our opening track, Got This Thing on the Move. Track 2, we are going to High Tide's debut album, Sea Shanties, and the opening track, Feudalist's Lament. Now, there are just so many tracks to pick from. This whole album is just really heavy, crunchy guitar, drums, bass, vocals, and of course, not an organ, but an electric violin. This is an interesting album because it combines this approach to heavy rock with a Baroque progressive rock feel to it, a Baroque sound to the progressive rock style. They do make good use of the violin as well as of the heavy electric guitar. If you find violin with heavy guitar a little bit of a turnoff, Feudalist's Lament is probably the best track to go with because the violin is so distorted, and also it sounds like in some parts like it could be a wah-wah pedal used on an electric guitar rather than a violin. The opening riff is just really mean and gritty and full of distortion. Lyrically, the song is also quite dark. You'll particularly notice the lines, smell of burning flesh in the air, screaming child, must you stare? So that kind of impression in the lyrics, which sounds pretty metal anyway. It is an excellent heavy track, really good guitar solo in here by Tony Hill. And I think, yeah, just a monster track to put on as the second track of the album, and atmospherically quite different in its feeling to the opening track. Our third track, I've always loved this song, but I also feel it is surprisingly, by the band in question, it is surprisingly almost closer to punk in a way. The guitar tone is very raw and the vocal style is very shouted and abrasive rather than the more raspy, powerful, soulful voice that we hear of some singers like Mark Farner of Grand Funk Railroad, or just a little bit more of a downer toned voice of Tony Hill on sea shanties. So the song I'm talking about is the Nile song from Pink Floyd's album soundtrack for the movie More. There are actually two really heavy tracks on here, the other one being Ibiza Bar, but that one is a little bit more toned down. It's like they went out of control for the Nile song and then they got it back together again for Ibiza Bar. The Nile song, probably you've heard it. It's just really loud and abrasive. Nick Mason's drums, he's really thumping on the bass drum in a couple of parts. David Gilmour is screaming his head off near the end of the song, and I find his final wow has so much power behind it. It sounds really serious. This is a very loud song, very unusual for Pink Floyd, and it's almost as if, you know, Paul McCartney wrote Helter Skelter to one up The Who for I Can See for Miles, and it's as if Pink Floyd said, Helter Skelter, we're going to give you the Nile song, okay? So it is almost more in touch with something like the MC5 in a way, just because I feel it has a bit more of a punk vibe to it, but not quite. So I'm going just to really shake things up with the Nile song for the third track. Now we're going to take a very different move here. I had reasons for not including this next track on, and specifically it's because it has a very quiet, soft and mellow, but haunting atmosphere to it. And then when it gets heavy, it gets really freaking heavy. So I don't have the original album. What I have is a compilation here. This is the best of Vanilla Fudge, and the song I'm looking at is Some Velvet Morning, which is actually a cover song that appeared on their album Near the Beginning. This one here. If you have not heard this is pretty amazing. It does start off very quiet, a little bit eerie with the organ sound and the drums coming in. There's a bit of pacing going on, and then it just comes crashing down. The bass is loud and fuzzy. The guitars slamming and distorted. The drums pounding. There's one part, you got to hear this here. Listen to this part. That is Carmen Appice totally giving her. I'm telling you. So what I find really cool about this song is it goes between that very light, almost eerie, haunting part. It's like somebody who is just so beaten down by heartache that he's probably taken to drink, and he's coming into a lucid moment and just very calmly trying to tell you about what happened. And then it gets to this kind of, it's a very pretty late 60s hippie-ish type of part of the singing about the flowers and do not touch. And then the lyrics go, Phaedra is her name. And then everything comes crashing down again. I mean, when you get to the heavy part in the song here, and it is reiterated 3 times after the beginning, this is like doomsday. It's not going to be fire and brimstone. It is going to be thundering guitars, crashing drums, and psionic stabs to the cerebral cortex with the organ. It is such a rush to hear that heavy part. So for something a little bit different and something really crushing as well, I'm going with Some Velvet Morning by Vanilla Fudge. We're going to end side 1 with just a really loud, hard rockin' track with, again, those powerful, raspy type vocals. This is a French band called Les Variations, and from their album Nador in 1969. Interesting thing is that 3 of the members are actually originally from Morocco, and 1 member is Italian-French. This is a very solid hard rock album. I mean, really hard rock album if you have not heard it. Electric guitars, organ, drums, bass, and those powerful vocals with the rasp, right? I do recall that there is, so the title track on here is actually an acoustic track, and we do have a bit of piano in some songs, but there are at least a few really hard rockin' songs, and the opening one, What a Mess Again, is my choice. That is just one hell of a great hard rockin' track. I originally thought maybe to end the sign with the Vanilla Fudge one because it stops rather suddenly, but I felt after that really heavy and almost depressing and crushing song, we're going to end it up somewhere like how we began, with just a really solid, hard rockin' loud track. So that is What a Mess Again by Les Variations. This album was actually, I think, recorded in England, so it should have been somewhat accessible. Moving on to side 2, I'm going to go with a track from Andromeda's album. So this is a special collection CD. I think the original cover had this color scheme to it. It's a double CD, including their one and only album, plus additional tracks that were released or perhaps not released at the time, and then just a bunch of other studio things and live things. Anyway, that doesn't matter. We're going with what was released on the original album, and this is also a very solid, hard rocking album. There's very little to do with acoustic guitar on here. And one interesting thing is that a couple of the tracks are actually a little bit longer and broken into parts. So there's almost that progressive element coming in. Of course, the guitarist is John Can, or John Ducan, who would go on to play in Atomic Rooster after this. There are 3 or 4 tracks I could have gone with, but I decided in the end to go with the one that I originally considered. This is called Return to Sanity. I think it opens, well, let's try track 5, so it probably opened side 2 on the original album as well. We have Breakdown, Hope, and Conclusion. Now, if you have not heard this song and you go ahead and listen to it, you will recognize that the opening part here, Breakdown, that is exactly Holst's Mars Bringer of War music theme. And I did a video on that earlier, so I'll put a link up there to it. You can click on that if you want to see it, where I talked about the influence of Holst's Mars Bringer of War in rock music bands that borrowed from it to give their music a really heavy sound. And Black Sabbath were certainly big users of the music from that. They made some changes to it, but you will certainly recognize it from Diamond Head's song Am I Evil, which was of course later on covered by Metallica. It also appeared in other songs, which if you watch that video, I'll talk about it. So we've got that right from the beginning, that very, very dark and heavy sound that was very influential on the early days of heavy rock there in the late 60s. It then goes into the second part, Hope, which is a little bit more calmer, but during the chorus parts, it gets more hard rocking. And then the song concludes revisiting that Mars Bringer of War theme again. So a song that has very dark, menacing, and heaviness to it, as well as more of a lighter touch, and then some hard rockin' parts in between. So pretty much a good idea of what we can expect from metal. In fact, you could almost imagine a band from the 1980s covering this track. Our second track on side 2 gets a little bit theatrical and dramatic. For that reason, I almost excluded it. However, there's no denying that the guitars on this track are really what you would expect from heavy metal at that time. So this is a band called Writing on the Wall, and their album The Power of the Picks from 1969, and there is a track on here called Aries. Now the vocals in Aries are poetry. It is dramatically read poetry, and sometimes it just sounds like exclamations. Like in one part he's shouting, "Oh my God, I think it blew my mind. My God, I think it blew my mind." Sounds interesting. But it is, yeah, the guitars certainly are really loud bar chords, distorted riffs, really cool like that. They do have a lot of organ in their music, and I think that's one of the things, as I said, you cannot impose 1984 on 1969, because playing with an organ in your music was very common. Of course, we had Vanilla Fudge doing it, Deep Purple doing it, soon Uriah Heep would be doing it, and a number of other bands, including Atomic Rooster. So there is that, but just because there's so much solid, heavy, hard-hitting guitar on here, it really should be at least up for consideration. And I felt it just made a good addition to the album to add some variety, showing different ways that bands were using heavy music. So yeah, that is Aries from Writing on the Wall. Our third track on side 2 was the last one to be chosen, and it was in competition with a couple of other tracks that I was considering, which I mentioned in that other video that I will link at the end of this one here. But I finally decided to go with this one anyway. So this is Taste from Ireland. This is Rory Gallagher's band that he was in. They released a couple of albums, 2 or 3 albums before he went solo. It is mostly a blues album. There's some acoustic stuff. There's some tracks on here that are, well, of the time. But it is the opening track, Blister on the Moon, that really stands apart from the rest of the album if you're into that early, heavy, hard rock sound. I think that's what really made the choice for me, was some of the guitar parts in here just really sound like a very proto-metal style. The actual lyric delivery and the actual lyrical part of the songs, a little bit more mellowed down, but there's so much hard-hitting, punchy, and hefty guitar in the other parts in here, so I felt that that was my selection. If you have another song you'd rather put in there instead, you can let me know about it in the comments, but I'm going with Blister on the Moon from Taste. Our fourth track is actually one that I knew from the beginning I wanted to put on, even though there are reasons for not including it. I'm talking about Peace, Love and Man from Blossom Toes, their second album, If Only for a Moment. So the opening track, Peace, Love and Man, there are basically 3 or 4 parts to it. You have a more atmospheric or moody setting that is not heavy. Then you've got the heavy vocal parts with a very gruff, gurgly, growly voice, which is really cool. And then it goes into a more heavy, groovy part. And then we've got this more psychedelic part where there's different sound effects and playing with the audio effects and so on. So it's got a fair bit of variety in it. And that's why I say that, this is very much a list from 1969. We can't exclude those 1969 elements. I also forgot to mention that the chorus sounds much more like a southern rock type of song. The lead guitar that is playing in the melody of the chorus sounds more like a fiddle at first, but it is actually an electric guitar. Why I'm choosing this is just because the heavy parts are just so deliciously heavy, and this particular CD here is wonderfully remastered. It's just a very full, rich sound, which is not something you get on every album from 1969. There are a lot of reissues that are coming from a vinyl master. This one here sounds wonderful. So the heavy parts really stand out, and then just those insane growly vocals. It's like a precursor to death metal growls. Not exactly the same vocal style, but certainly pretty crazy. So that is Blossom Toes with Peace, Love and Man. So there are a couple of bands you could probably think of that have not been mentioned yet. And when I show you the last one, if you're going to think, well, what about that other band? And what about that other band? Well, do check out that video I'll talk about at the very end here. But for now, I want to close our 1969 hard and heavy rock, proto-metal, first wave of heavy metal, whatever you want to call it. I want to close our album with Dazed and Confused from Led Zeppelin's debut album. I really have always loved that song. There is that wonderful, unsettling atmosphere. And, in the slower parts at the beginning, there's power behind it, but there's also this almost, I guess you'd call it a psychedelic feel. There's this space in the mind of things not going well, but we're just not really fully letting it out of our system. And then, of course, you get into the slamming heavy parts. That guitar tone is just to die for. I just love the guitar tone on this album, and it really shines on Dazed and Confused. And then, of course, we flip over to the high speed part and Jimmy Page's guitar solo. After we had, of course, the bowed guitar effect. And it just rolls and rocks. The drums are going nuts. The bass is going nuts. The lead guitar playing, and Robert Plant is just, keeping up with the lead guitar, shouting all sorts of screaming things in the background. And then it comes with this very dramatic conclusion, hard-hitting guitar chords. John Bonham is just rolling away with the drums and then slamming down again with those heavy chords and then finishing the song once more with the same atmosphere that we started with. I think this is really a fantastic song. That really is a good argument for the beginnings of heavy metal, even if you don't want to call Led Zeppelin heavy metal. I know that's no longer in vogue. That was maybe in the 1970s and up to somewhere in the early 80s we did that, and now we no longer do. But this album for me is such an important one because it was first of all released in January of 1969, and it really showed the change in the trend of heavy music. I mean, prior to that, if you think of January 1968, we're looking at Blue Cheer, Iron Butterfly, Steppenwolf, and coming up to 1969, this is a real game changer. I mean, after this is the direction you got to go in. And Grand Funk Railroad's album is a pretty good indicator of that style as well. So anyway, that is our final track from side 2, and that is my list of 10 wonderfully hard and heavy songs from 1969 that tell us that heavy metal is coming, whether you like it or not. All right, so there were probably a number of tracks that you might be thinking of that I did not mention in this video, and if you watch that other video, you might hear me talk about them there. But if I don't, in any case, please let me know some of the heavy tracks you would choose. Possibly I considered them and I just decided, in my opinion, to go with these other ones instead and leave those ones out. Possibly I didn't consider them and I need to know about them. And some of them probably I just don't have the albums. And most importantly is if you know of a really killer heavy track from 1969 that I did not mention in this video and not in the other one here, let me know, because if I don't have it, I'm probably going to want to track it down and get it. All right, thank you so much for watching. I am looking forward to hearing any comments about heavy rock, heavy metal, heavy hard rock, whatever from 1969. We'll catch you in another video sometime, everyone. Take care all, and bye.